afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Heather, for that fulsome introduction, which, of course, I wrote myself. The 150th anniversary of the Underground is our topic this afternoon. It's been a great opportunity to kind of reflect and review just how kind of profound the contribution of the Underground to London has been, and as well as authoring a kind of new social history of the Tube, which of course I recommend to you all. We've done a couple of key restoration projects. We've restored the first locomotive, the last locomotive built by the Metropolitan Railway at Neasden in 1898, and run it on the Underground in passenger service. First time passengers have been hauled by a steam engine on the Met underground since 1905. Great fun, as you can imagine. If I get through my slides quick enough, I'll show you some film of that at the end. And also we've restored a Metropolitan Railway four-wheel carriage from 1892. And that was with the assistance of the Heritage Lottery Fund. And this autumn we're running station tours of the Aldwych, which I fear are already completely sold out throughout November. And the Active Depot, our store, is actually open for a weekend, and there are some leaflets on the table on the way in. So let's get to grips with, get as far into these slides as we can. My thesis really is the Underground's kind of contribution to London has been perhaps underestimated. Many one-volume histories kind of deal with it slightly quickly in kind of 3 or 4 page sections, rather than kind of looking at that kind of profound and pervasive influence on the capital's politics, on its economy, on its culture, on its architecture, and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look in particular at the Victorian Underground, because it's been kind of in the news this year, because we've kind of recreated it. And then we're going to have a dash through the subsequent 150 years, just to kind of get a sense of that contribution to the city. And of course the Underground has typically been taken for granted by its greatest beneficiaries, its passengers. There's a long history of criticism of the Underground, which actually started on the Wednesday after the 10th of January 1863, when it opened for the first time, and has continued pretty well unabated since. But I think it demonstrates its kind of importance to everyone. In the 1840s and 50s, London was growing incredibly fast. Population of around 3 million. It's the kind of commercial, political, financial heart of a world-flung empire. Business is booming in the middle of the century, and people began to be concerned that the city would grind to a halt, almost due to its success. Probably the person who's more responsible for the original building of the Metropolitan Railway, first section from Paddington to Farringdon, is Charles Pearson, top right here, who's the city solicitor, essentially the kind of chief executive then of the city corporation. And he was a philanthropist who believed in major infrastructure projects having not only serving the mobility of the city, but also serving kind of wider social and civic objectives, demolition of bad housing in the centre, enabling people to live kind of further out in better parts of the city. But it did take him 18 years to get his project off the ground. He first published in the 1840s, and Spade didn't hit the ground until 1860. And so there's a long history of infrastructure projects taking a while to get through the system. What he essentially did was put a conventional railway underground. It's underground, but in a mixture of tunnels and cuttings, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you. And the amount of disruption in the city for the building of this cut and cover method was pretty extraordinary. As we see, this is near Paddington. Basically, the middle of the road is dug up, a huge trench is built, and then roofed over again over a period of 2 or 3 years. And you can imagine the Euston Road, or the Marylebone Road, with this kind of site down the middle of it. It excited a lot unhappiness at the time, and of course wasn't to be quickly repeated later in the century. The early stations were rather fine. Some of them were completely underground, like Baker Street and Portland Road. Others, such as King's Cross on the left, had these very fine cast iron and glass canopies over the top of the cutting in which the station was situated. And you'll note, the eagle-eyed viewer will note on the left that this is a mixed gauge railway. It was going to be originally run for the Metropolitan Railway by the Great Western, who wanted to bring trains through from the main line, from Paddington, through into the city. The Great Western and the Metropolitan Railway fell out with each other pretty rapidly, and it became a standard gauge railway from 1866 onwards. The stations were quite fine, rather nice kind of classical palaces on either side of the road, covering the steps that led down to platform level. This is the familiar chromolithograph of Baker Street, around about the time of the opening. This is one of the genuinely underground stations, with light brought down through these vents. It also helps in dispelling the steam and the vapour from below, which was to be an increasing issue later in the century. Lit rather gradually, these gas globes. You can see dual gauge, and a train is just approaching from the Paddington direction. Yeah, there we are. And as typically with a lot of the early illustrations of the underground, you can see that the quality are being depicted as using the system. It was a very important part of the kind of marketing message. Actually, 70% of the tickets were sold from the first year were third-class tickets, because it was a conventional railway with first, second, and third class. And it rapidly became a railway that was very important in moving everybody around London, not just the people in finery as we see on the platform here. We've got very few illustrations of the kind of early days of the Metropolitan Railway. This is Farringdon Street, which was the terminus in 1863, and you see a standard gauge train here on the right. This is one of the stations which was open to the air. Classical signal box on the left, and of course it's a view which you can still see to some extent today. The station has been altered, and of course it's been hugely extended recently for Thameslink, and it will become one of the busiest stations in the centre when Crossrail is opened in 2018, 2019. But Farringdon was the terminus. From early on, despite the kind of airy appearance of this photo, this engraving, the atmosphere was a source of some concern. And a gentleman, an engineer, was travelling on the Met with his wife between Edgware Road and King's Cross. And he said the condition of the atmosphere was so poisonous that although a mining engineer, I almost suffocated, was obliged to be assisted out of the train at an intermediate station. On reaching the open air, I requested to be taken to an alchemist's close at hand, means a chemist, and to him I explained as well as I could that I desired to have some restorative. Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Oh, I see, Metropolitan Railway," and at once poured out a wine glass for what I conclude he designates metropolitan mixture. Although very unwell, I was amused at the promptness with which he acted, and was induced to ask him whether he often had such cases, to which he rejoined, "Why, bless you, sir, we often have 20 cases a day." And another commentator said, "Those who travelled by the Met and have felt after coming out of the sulphurous atmosphere of the subterranean passage as if they had been chewing lucifer matches will rejoice to hear someday yet that the underground will be worked by electricity." More of that later. Another kind of rare view, this is Christophe Doré's illustration of, I think it's Baker Street, with one of these little locomotives of 1866 that the Met had built in Manchester to haul its own trains. You can see that waiting for third class board is available there, and you get a kind of sense of the crowded nature of the underground. It was a success from day one. It was carrying something like 26,500 passengers a day in the first few months of 1863. It was interesting. I think when the line first opened, people expected the being underground to be something really rather terrible and rather awful. It was quite clear the Illustrated London News felt slightly short-changed, as the experience really wasn't quite dramatic enough. They went on a trial run in 1862, and their journalists reported the general feeling was evidently that of agreeable disappointment. The open cuttings being more extensive and the tunnels better lighted and ventilated than was expected. And then this quotation from 1862, which kind of, I think, sums up what it might have been like to travel on the Met at that day. Although this curious and unique metropolitan railway has been turned underground or subterranean, for nearly half its length it's open to the light and air of heaven. Where it does pass various lengths beneath the surface, it's so well lighted and ventilated that the tunnels, instead of being close, damp, dark and offensive, are wide, spacious, clean and luminous, and more like a well-kept street by night than a subterranean passage through the very heart of the metropolis, reported the London Journal, a trial run in 1862. It took a long time to complete the circle. The map top left, the red outline shows the circle. It wasn't completed through the city until 1884. And indeed, the Metropolitan Railway and its sister railway, the Metropolitan District, which was set up to build and then operate the southern arm of the circle, saw far more potential in traffic in the western suburbs out to Ealing and Richmond and Wimbledon than in the very, very expensive completion of that arc through the city between Liverpool Street and Tower Hill. But eventually the Metropolitan Board of Works persuaded them by investing a considerable sum of money in the last phase of construction. And it's a continuous story through this 150 years that public investment is necessary to in infrastructure on a kind of continuous basis. And even though the underground is in the private sector to all intents and purposes until 1933, public investment at crucial moments of existence are very important. And indeed in 1863, the financial crash of the 1850s had led the scheme to be almost abandoned by the late 1850s. And it was only when Pearson persuaded his own city corporation to actually buy up shares in the Metropolitan Railway and then sell them once the railway was built that it was actually started. So that's a common theme as well. Here's one of the little steam locomotives. I can't quite remember where that one is. No, I've forgotten. Journalist Fred T. Jane had a cab ride around the circle in 1893 and drew these illustrations, which are all kind of all we've got really for what it might have been like to kind of experience the steam power and underground. On the left, you've got the Baker Street Junction, where what they call the main line goes off to the Chilterns on the right, and Baker Street Station you can see through the tunnel on the left. And this section, I think, is somewhere between Farringdon and King's Cross, where there's quite an open section with these girders across which you can still see. He said the train entered King's Cross at a rate of some 40 miles an hour, and then the road began to be uphill, and at the same time the air grew more foul. By the time we reached Gower Street, Euston Square today, I was coughing and spluttering like a boy with his first cigar. It's a little unpleasant when you ain't used to it, said the driver, with the composure born of long usage, but you ought to come on a hot summer day to get the real thing. And the real thing, of course, was a pretty intensive service. I mentioned that the first complaint in week 1 of operation was that the train had only stopped at Portland Road for 15 seconds before departing. It was quite clear that in days when health and safety wasn't so kind of to the fore as they are today, the train often passengers opened the doors of the train as it pulled into a station and only kind of closed them as the train disappeared down the tunnel. Because a very intensive service was being run from the off. As you see here, 18 trains an hour, 19 trains an hour on the different sections of the inner circle, which is a pretty intensive service. Not quite on the lines of today, more like 24 or 33 trains an hour, but still a very busy service. And of course, all of them steam hauled, and all of them contributing to that pretty poisonous atmosphere. The Met was very early into workman's tickets, the first railway to adopt the workman's tickets. If you travelled before 6 o'clock in the morning, you travelled for twopence as early as 1864. And that was a very significant advance, and it did mean that the railway was for all, and it meant that the railway's kind of wider social role in terms of enabling people to live further away from their place of work, particularly working men, further away from those kind of Dickensian rookeries in the centre of London, which had been to some extent swept away along the routes of the Met, quite deliberately by Pearson's plan, was enabled. This is Moorgate in the 1860s or 70s, I can't quite remember the date of this one. This is Mansion House Station in the 1870s. Again, it's one of those, we're looking just to kind of get some sense of the atmosphere visually. You can see the station platforms in the background, and on the left, the green livery of the Metropolitan District Railway at that date, which has been coaled by hand, and there's a guy on the extreme left with a basket of coal, which he's filling a bunker with, and the locomotive was intended to drop the water in its tanks on every trip round the circle, which took about 65 minutes, and replenish the tanks with cold water, so that the condensing apparatus over the top of the tank had some chance of working. But if the service was running a bit behind, it was quite clear the controller suggested to the driver he should go around again, and that's when I think the fumes become particularly noxious. This is Charing Cross, 1894, very rare photograph of the train in the station, albeit slightly blurred. You can see the wonderful kind of array of adverts on the station that made it quite difficult to work out where you were, of which more on the next slide. There's a lovely quote in a novel of The Spawn of Fortune, 1896, which I think sort of captions this picture rather well. A few waiting passengers sauntered up and down the platform. Smoke hung about in fantastic blue whiffs, writhing and twisting and swirling lazily towards the roof, and the gas burned yellow in the glass globes that hung above the doorway. And then two yellow eyes trembled and blinked in the darkness. In the next instant, a Richmond train came wheezing, rocking, screeching and grinding out of the blackness and stopped with a jerk on the platform. Platform view of Victoria. There's you can see the problem with it was quite hard to work out whether you'd arrive at a station called Zeebrite Hague Scotch Whisky or and eventually, from early as 1908, the Underground began putting its station names onto red discs, like the one on the top right, as a way of just kind of just making them stand out from all that advertising verbiage on the platform. Punch in 1895 had a fantastic little kind of verse. It said, "I bought from the stall at Victoria a horrible sixpenny story, a book of a kind it pained me to find for sale at our underground emporia." And quite snobbish about the kind of rubbish that you could buy, presumably at this type of vendor. High and Low, wrote George Gissing in the year of the Jubilee, published in 1894, on every available yard of wall, advertisements clamoured to the eye. Theatres, journals, soaps, medicines, concerts, furniture, wines, prayer meetings, all the produce and refuse of civilization announced in staring letters, in daubed effigies, base, paltry and grotesque, a battleground of advertisements, fitly chosen amid suburban din and reek, a symbol to the gaze of that relentless warfare which ceases not night and day in the world above. And the world above was still kind of pretty busy. This is, on the left, another Dore illustration of Ludgate Hill and Ludgate Circus, with the bridge now lost across the hill to Holden Viaduct. As you can see, just in that illustration alone, there's a funeral, a flock of sheep, omnibuses, horses and carts, huge quantity of pedestrians. Later in the century, London's streets are kind of yet again threatening to grind to a halt, and the only solution is yet again to innovate. And in some ways, this is the more significant innovation than the Metropolitan Railway in 1863. The City and South London Railway was opened in 1890 from King William Street, near the Bank, beneath the Thames to Stockwell. And when it was built, it was the world's first electric-powered deep tube railway. And 3 technologies enable that to happen. One is safe tunnelling technology, using the Great Head Shield, top right here. Of course, the shield had been first developed by Brunel's father for the Wapping Rotherhithe tunnel, the Thames Tunnel, much earlier in the century. The availability of lifts from America, not to go up and down in high buildings, but to take you down below the ground. And they developed a multiple unit and electric traction technology, which came from America. And so the little City and South London Railway was the first. It wasn't wildly successful, like a lot of pioneer lines. It had its problems. The little 3-carriage trains pulled by electric locomotives, very narrow platforms. Those of you who remember the Angel before it was rebuilt will have a sort of sense of a City and South London platform with trains on either side of an island platform. Always felt slightly insecure that the platform was never quite really wide enough, and it certainly feels that way here. It was greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm because it was clean and white. The tiling was white. It was very well lit by, as you can see, and I think it was a complete contrast to the Metropolitan and District Railways, which by then were pretty grubby. This is the City and South London station at Euston in the 1920s, just before it was widened. That's now, because City and South London line is now the city central piece of the city branch of the Northern line. You see these sweet little carriages. They didn't have windows in them originally, obviously designed by engineers. Rather than with the focus group, and the engineers thought, well, if you're underground, there's no reason to see out. But actually, people found this rather kind of unnerving, and I think Punch dubbed them padded cells within the first week or two of operation of this railway. But it does point the way to the future. It points the way to the Edwardian growth of the tube network. The first kind of really successful underground railway is the Central London Railway, opened down the line of Oxford Street from Shepherd's Bush to the Bank in 1900. This was a route down which 260, 270 omnibuses regularly plied their trade. It was a route which people wanted to travel up and down on, and was a commercial success from the start. It used rolling stock, which had lent a lot from American design, raffia-covered seats and clear stories. And again, you can see that a publicity postcard produced by the Central London Railway has very smart people travelling in. And the notion of strap hangers was imported from America as well. It was dubbed the Tuppenny Tube from very early on, because it was initially had a flat fare of tuppence, however far you wanted to go. Here's one of those tickets. The Tuppenny Tube does find its way into the lyrics of a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, and I'm just struggling to remember which one it was. And the sheet music of the day, the kind of hit parade of the day. I think we'd all like to know what R.G. Knowles' rendering of the Tuppenny Tube was like, but I'm afraid I can't play you that one just at the moment. But you can see on the poster here, which is produced by the railway in about 1905, you bought your ticket from a little tile ticket window, you presented it to a gate man, and popped it into a box as you went past. You proceeded down to the platform in lifts, and then here at the other end in town. The success of the Central London Railway brought a lot of other tube projects into existence, and eventually 3 are built and opened in 1905, 6, 7 to create this network. It's the first time a tube map pocket map was produced in 1908, because there was now a network to join up. You can see the branding underground with the dropped U and the dropped D, which is the first attempt by the Underground Electric Railway Company of London to kind of create the sense of a network rather than a series of disparate lines. It's a great story associated with the tube network. The finances were put together by a vent financier from Chicago called Charles Tyson Yerkes, and he persuaded a lot of people to invest in London at this era, particularly American backers. And his mission was to kind of create a network. So the branding of the underground, the Leslie Green tiled stations, Bull's Blood tiled stations were all kind of uniform. They had airspace over the top, much as the American pattern for later building. And the Yerkes Tube Network built the largest power station in the world at Locks Road, Chelsea, to power the tube network and the district railway, which he also owned. And he, before his premature death, leaving a lot of debts to lots of disappointed backers, had the notion that the tube should go out and create suburbs. And Golders Green was the kind of first tube suburb, and you've got there two views looking up the Finchley Road to the position of the new tube station. Top one in 1904, and the bottom one in 1912. You can see already that a suburb has kind of arrived in the space of 8 years. And the branding kind of extended to platform level, of course, as well. So here's a little 3-car train, not quite filling the platform, of course, Piccadilly Circus with Leslie Green's tile design, that unique tile design for each station, being evident in this postcard. What have we got on this slide? This is, because in the First World War, women arrived in the workforce in a very visible way on London buses and on the Underground. And the 2 pictures on the right illustrate that, with women did many different roles, particularly as station staff. When Maida Vale station on the Bakerloo opened in 1915, it was entirely staffed by women, and excited a lot of interest that such a thing could possibly work. During wartime, the Johnston typeface was first commissioned, which becomes a kind of symbol almost of London's alphabet, a symbol of modernity of design, which was to be very much a feature of the 20s and the 30s. And the first escalator was installed at Earl's Court in 1911, and here this poster of 1912 shows the moving staircase connection, as it was described, at Paddington Station. And this is Eva Carver, who was a Metropolitan Railway guard working on the Hammersmith and City line. And she was photographed here just as her war work ended in 1919, both in uniform and in civvies. And of course, the women all lost their jobs in 1919. Lord Ashfield very kindly invited them to a large tea party and presented them a certificate of thanks as all the men came back from the forces. But there's a very rich vein of kind of cartoons and comment on women in the transport workforce during the First World War, which we're going to be playing within our exhibition next year, which we're calling Goodbye Piccadilly. The 1920s and 30s were the kind of sort of golden age in many ways, until recently, of the application of really good design principles to everything to do with the railway, and of course across the network to buses as well. This was down to Frank Pick. Probably, I think Frank Pick had the greatest kind of individual influence on our city of anybody since Christopher Wren. Discuss. Pick arrived from the North Eastern Railway as traffic and publicity manager. His job was to increase traffic on that railway, which the American backers were slightly disappointed. They hadn't quite risen to the levels they'd been promised by Yerkes before his death. They wanted a return on their investment. And branding of the system, creation of that underground brand, the production of pictorial posters, such as this one, a very early one for Golders Green, was very much part of Pick's response to that problem. And he becomes commercial director of the Underground Group in 1912. He's managing director by 1920, and he becomes the first chief executive of London Transport when it's created in 1933. And so it's down to him that Johnston reworks the roundel into its characteristic form in about 1921-22. He commissions wonderful station designs from Charles Holden, particularly on the extension of the Northern Line south in the 20s and Piccadilly Line north in the early 30s. Both projects done on the basis of government guarantees of contracts to promote work both in London and big contracts for kind of steel and rolling stock and so forth elsewhere in the country during the recession. That's another common theme. This is Piccadilly Circus, which was the almost, I think of this cutting-edge design, really wonderful Art Deco reworking of a rabbit warren in the station by Charles Holden in 1928. Travertine marble, polished bronze, poster surrounds, little shops and so forth. One of the kind of great triumphs of public transport architecture. And of course, I think London Underground is still the largest landlord of listed buildings in London. Its total is currently 71, and some of the best mid-century modern buildings as we found on the Underground estate. The notion of overcrowding has always been a problem because the Tube has always been incredibly successful. It's got a symbiotic relationship with the growth of the city. The top left is a crowd of people trying to get onto gate stock in the rush hour in 1919. The journalist R.D. Blumenfeld tells a wonderful story about going out to dinner and was packed into the end platforms of the gate stock, and gate stock is so called because it has metal gates and partitioning at the end. And he said by the time he got to his dinner, then he still had the mark of the gates on the back of his velvet dinner jacket, lattice shape, so squeezed as he'd been into the carriage. The Piccadilly Circus 1922, I think, is the next one down. In 1925, Finsbury Park was, of course, the northern terminus of the then Piccadilly line, and regularly saw something close to pandemonium, something like a free fight in the evening rush hour at Finsbury Park. Newspaper accounts describe how men and women fight like rugby players to reach their homes, and the clothes are torn and fainting girls and women are so common as to pass almost without comment. It was clearly a desperate situation, and one of the reasons for the Piccadilly line being extended northwards pretty soon afterwards. And the top photograph is just the 1950s, and there's a rather marvellous lament from the London Transport Executive when they lament the fact that the problem is that the public packs itself in, and they will use the railway, and at the executive's heavy expense. Just some more examples of those kind of wonderful stations. Morden, 1932, on the southern terminus of Northern Line, which of course was intended to go further, but the Southern Railway objected to the Underground pinching its suburban electric trade, so it didn't get as far as Sutton as it might have done. And Southgate, of course, the top, that marvellous circular station building. All the street furniture around it, including the lamp standards and the poles with underground signs on, all designed by Charles Holden. We have a wonderful drawing of Southgate, all signed off by Frank Pick in the box on the right-hand side in his characteristic green ink. And there's a fairly undistinguished drawing of, I think, the lamp standard with the underground roundel on it, where Pick has signed it off in green ink under duress. He was clearly all over design of everything at this date, and he lays down such a kind of profoundly embedded design DNA into the organisation that it echoes down through years of neglect later and to this day. And of course the Tube, between wars, begins to enable the creation of London's suburbs. It's perhaps responsible amongst other agencies for the fact that London's a flat city and has moved outwards rather than upwards, at least until recently. These are construction photographs in the middle of some of those extensions. I love the photograph. Bottom left is actually Neasden, when Neasden was all fields before the Underground built, because enormous works next to the line, just north of the station. And then there's the marvellous creation of Metroland as a marketing place-selling concept by the Metropolitan Railway, slightly bizarrely introduced first during the First World War. But the Metroland booklets go up to joining in with London Transport in 1933 and sell this marvellous image of suburbia. And I like this quote from the 1920s edition. The strain which the London business professional man has to undergo amidst the turmoil and bustle of town can only be counteracted by the quiet restfulness and comfort of residence amidst pure air and surroundings. And whilst jaded vitality and taxed nerves are the natural penalties of modern conditions, nature has, in the delightful districts abounding in Metroland, placed a potential remedy at hand. Metroland Guidebook, 1920s. During the Second World War, people expected to shelter in the Underground, as they had done under aerial attack during the First War. A little known episode which we're just exploring at the moment. And initially, the Underground tried to stop people from using the stations for sheltering, the platforms for sheltering. But eventually, I think Londoners voted with their feet. And they've done it in the First World War, so why shouldn't they now? And the whole business of sheltering underground became much more organised, with tickets issued and rudimentary facilities at the ends of platforms installed. We sort of debunk this a little bit in the book, because actually only about 3% of Londoners sheltering, and on the worst nights of the Blitz, actually sheltered in tube stations. One slightly gets the impression from propaganda of the day that Gert and Daisy were having a fantastic knees up down on the platform while the bombers droned overhead. Actually, it was pretty uncomfortable, it was pretty unpleasant, pretty hard to sleep, and smelt rather awful, I suspect. But it became very much part of the city's sort of self-identity, and it was a very important part of the kind of London Can Take It campaign, which was, of course, eventually contributed to bringing America into the war. 800,000 children were evacuated by London Transport during the start of the Phoney War in September 1939. An enormous kind of integrated transport operation. After the war, much of the investment from the government investment goes into the overground, goes into British Rail, nationalised, of course, in 1948, and in a terrible state, generally speaking, after the war. Whereas the Underground wasn't in too bad a state. It had a lot of success and a lot of expansion in the 20s and 30s. There were 1 or 2 new stations built. This is Gants Hill, 1947. It's a sort of miniature version of the Moscow Metro. And interestingly, the only public honour to date which Frank Pick was awarded was the Order of Lenin Third Class for helping design the Moscow Metro for the then mayor, Stalin, in the late 20s and 30s. New aluminium rolling stock. This is a new car being exhibited on the South Bank for the Festival of Music in 1951. Aluminium car, unpainted, was to be the kind of fashion in the 50s and 60s before vandalism became a bit of a problem. The 60s saw the underground beginning to kind of get off the pace, I think, both managerially and in design terms. There are virtually no posters in the 1960s. This one by Hans Ummer in 1966 is virtually the only kind of pop art piece of work done for the underground at this era. The underground celebrated its centenary in 1963. There was a very telling speech by the then chairman, Alec Valentine, at the Mansion House, and in it he alluded to the fact that with the growth of traffic on the roads and problems with bus services in London Transport in the 50s and early 60s, there may come a time when buses will not subsidise the underground anymore, and we might have to ask the public purse to make up the difference. And of course, that's to be the story, in effect, for the next 50 years of the politics of transport, as the underground in particular demands subsidy from the public purse, which it had never had to manage with before. And I guess perhaps, one has to remember that, as with the kind of Moscow Metro story, that actually the underground was looked to by cities around the world into the 60s as the place to kind of go and understand how an underground railway should work and how it should be designed. The Victoria Line is almost the last moment when London is in the lead, I think, until perhaps recently. Opened in 69, here's the Queen, with Chairman Maurice Holmes on the left, and Eric Wilkins, the publicity officer, and Anthony Bull, deputy chair, and Richard Marsh, then transport minister. She drove the train from Oxford Circus, from Green Park to Oxford Circus. Tom Eckersley's wonderful cut paper design for the Victoria Line poster there. This was the world's first automatic railway. All the driver had to do, technically speaking, was open and close the doors. Everything else was done by transponders in the track. Huge technical innovation. And it was also the first railway in the world with automatic ticketing systems. You remember those yellow tickets with a brown magnetic back to them. But of course, if you only have half the system, or one line on the system, operating a ticketing system like this, it becomes a little clunky, and actually these gates were removed after three or four years. It's not until the 80s that the system becomes fully gated. The other thing I think is true at this date is that although the underground is building big prestige projects like the Victoria Line, the rest of the system is being gently neglected. I rather like the story from London Underground Railway Society News. A large rat from the Victoria Line workings was the cause of considerable alarm and despondency on the 30th of May 1967. Among the passengers, particularly the ladies, when it boarded a train on the Central Line at Oxford Circus. It ran around for a few minutes before a passenger killed it and threw the remains out at Holborn. The 70s sees the Jubilee Line, although only half the Jubilee Line, opened as far as Charing Cross. They go for a kind of rather more kind of colourful, lively look to the station. This is Prince Charles driving the first train, and Hannah Downs became the first woman train operator in 1978. But meanwhile, the politics of the tube and the general state of the infrastructure were definitely in decline. And although there were one or two spectacular kind of refittings of stations like this one, Tottenham Court Road by Palazzi, Charing Cross, Embankment, and so forth at this date, generally speaking, a lot more of the system looked like the train at Ongar here in 1986. There's old rolling stock, vandalism, and a kind of poor management of the system had set in. One of the great kind of I think signs of turning point is the fair's fair debate. Ken Livingstone became leader of the GLC, then running the Tube in 1981, and proposed to subsidise the fares more than had been before and reduce them to try and build traffic back on the system. It's quite odd to think that actually the patronage of the Underground was declining during the 70s and the 80s. It fell to 498 million journeys a year in 1982. Today it's 1.2 billion, and had been 600,000 to 700,000 in the 60s. And there was a spectacular court case where the London Borough of Bromley took him and the GLC to court. Fares were then doubled, and I haven't got time to go through the whole kind of sorry story, but in many ways it was the first inkling that the notion that you have to invest in the Underground for kind of general civic benefit. One of the side issues that comes out of that era is the creation of the travel card for the first time in 1983. And the travel card leads, I think, seamlessly to Oyster in the 2000s. I just love this picture. And the photographer just couldn't believe his luck. A photographer called Wazzy Diaz, who's done quite a lot of work for the museum in the 80s. And he was out photographing the Northern Line, and the kind of direct train at Ongo was one of his pictures. Just happened to have the camera up when this woman obligingly produced the Evening Standard saying Margaret Thatcher was one of the chapters in the book is called Transport is Politics, which is a quote from Tony Ridley, who was chief executive up to the King's Cross fire. Ashfield and Pick had been the kind of formidable pair who had led the London transport in the 30s up to the Second World War. Things had become a lot more difficult as subsidy was needed, and politicians began to be kind of unhappy with the state of the Tube and unhappy with the quality, I think, as well, of the management. You have the huge spats under Tory-controlled administration in the 70s, when still basically transport policy was around roads rather than public transport. And you have the whole issue of overrun on the Jubilee line, which leads to PPP. There's a whole kind of story around the kind of politics and financing of the Tube, which is very much the story of these years. But the kind of poor state of the system really finds its kind of awful nemesis at King's Cross fire in 1987. And when the Fennell report came out a year later, it demonstrated that not only was the system kind of full of rubbish, badly managed, there was actually virtually no management on the system. The managing director who came to clear out the mess, Dennis Tunnicliffe, described the Underground as something that happened rather than that was managed at that era. And the profound change which came from 88 onwards in terms of management, fire safety and the investment argument probably wouldn't have happened without the dreadful events at King's Cross of that night. The other great issue of this era, of course, is the creation of Docklands. Docklands takes off in the early 80s in quite a modest way, and Toy Town Railway, DLR, is opened first in 1982. Is almost inadequate from the moment it opens. And eventually the Jubilee line is extended to Canary Wharf. It's interesting that the Canary Wharf original proponents, the Reitman brothers, had proposed a kind of equivalent of the Waterloo and City line that went only from Canary Wharf to Waterloo, dubbed in the textbooks the Canary Loo line. But the Underground and politicians argue very, very hard for a railway that had intermediate stations. And I think it's very significant that when the Jubilee line is built, it's built with enormous stations that are capable of expansion. And again, we return to form with architecture that's kind of out of the top drawer. The Jubilee line, though, it goes well over budget and time for a number of reasons, and that leads to the public-private partnership fiasco of the early 2000s. But I think what is significant is that really from the late 80s, early 90s onwards, there's a consensus amongst business and politicians in London that you just have to invest in the underground if you're going to invest in the city. Two terrible days in 2007, that awful contrast between securing the Olympics one day and the 7/7 bombings the next. I think what's interesting is just to draw a parallel between King's Cross Fire and 7/7. For years after the King's Cross Fire, the underground had non-stop kind of knocking copy, and probably well justified in the press for its poor performance. Whereas at 7/7, everybody kind of could only note that the systems had all worked, and that all that kind of fire protection that had been put in the 80s and 90s after King's Cross actually delivered, and there wasn't a fire, even though you had those 3 bombings on the system. And so, pushing time, so let's hurry through these last few. Crossrail launched in 2010. Politicians looking at a model of it, top right. That process of kind of continuous investment, and TfL kind of delivering on major projects like new trains on the Metropolitan Railway, or the creation of the overground out of old bits of rather poorly managed British rail, has very much continued, and we'll see more of that coming years. So some of those franchises out of Liverpool Street will be taken up by Crossrail from 2015 onwards, Greater Anglia franchises. And this is the Commissioner driving his bus down Oxford Street with the torch on board. The bit I like about the story is that the Olympic authorities had insisted he wasn't allowed to put the rings on the front. And so he said that he wouldn't. And so they just wound the blind round a bit further. And so they set off down Oxford Street with the torch. And as you remember, that kind of culmination of all that fantastic torch ceremony across the country. And when they got around the corner into Regent Street, Leon Daniels, the managing director for Service Transport, hopped out and wound down the blind, and down came the rings, and so you can still got it on the front. Boris seeing off the first tunnel boring machine. Crossrail will start to add up to 10% more capacity to the underground in 2018 to 2021. And Crossrail 2 is already being kind of advocated for, the sort of Hackney to Chelsea diagonal line across London. And at the rate which London is now growing, expecting to go north of 9 million after 2020, the capacity on the system, despite the changing patterns of work, the persuasiveness of living and working and socialising in London, will still put enormous pressure on the underground network. And so we celebrated by running a steam engine and original Metropolitan Railway carriages from Olympia to Moorgate in January this year. And I can reveal to you we'll be doing the same next August, when we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Hammersmith City bit of the line. And here's the train arriving at Moorgate in January with the new S-Dock train on the right, and Met number 1 with 2 actors duly done up for the occasion on the left. I think probably I ought to call a halt at that point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that very speedy history through a journey through the history of the Tube. We do have time for a few questions. If any